internet, I can't see your beautiful faces, I can see your beautiful faces, and they are stunning. I'm Dr. Ben Wiley van Eerd, and we are starting our minor party debate. It's the debate that the mainstream media did not think it would be profitable to show you, but we're going to show you because we think you deserve the best. You deserve to see all of the different parties, all the different candidates that you can vote for in this election. We have for you three brilliant candidates today. We have Geoff Simmons, leader of the Opportunities Party. We have Amanda Vickers, who's the Deputy Leader of Social Credit New Zealand. And we have Leighton Baker, leader of the New Conservatives. Now, I have drawn their names from a hat, and the order in which we're going to be doing our topics today is first Leighton, then Geoff, then Amanda. They're going to have 3 minutes each to discuss the following topics. And topic number one, we'll just get right into it, I think. No more wasting time now that everybody's got their drinks and sat down. Topic number one, Leighton, farming, New Zealand's future. Give it up for Leighton Baker.
Thanks for coming out, guys, and thank you for the viewers out there. My topic is on farming and why it is so important for New Zealand's future. There's only about 13,000 farming families in New Zealand, but they bring in about 30% of our income. And we really, really need that at the moment because we've lost a whole lot of our income with our international tourism disappearing. And so somehow we must generate income to actually pay for the huge debt we've incurred through COVID. And farming is a great way that we can do that. There's some issues facing farming at the moment. It seems that the government of the day would like to get farmers off the land. And you guys may or may not have seen the winter grazing rules that have just come in. But the winter grazing rules basically make it impossible for farmers to winter graze their stock on the paddock. And so what do they do then? It's simply more pressure put on by a government that doesn't actually understand that we do need income, we do need productivity. We can't all just feed off the productive sector. And so for us, we're saying actually we need to look after farmers. We need to support them, we need to encourage them, and we need to invest our money in research and development to help them farm better. There's a proposal at the moment on using pine trees for carbon credits. The problem is when you plant the pine trees, they destroy the land. It's a very short-term outcome, and you reduce the amount of farming you get on the land. You're not going to get the income off the pine trees. In fact, we are paying people to plant those pine trees with our carbon credits. That has no long-term future for us as a nation. If you want to store carbon, yes, you can use the pine trees, but you're far better off for the land, for our health and for our wealth to actually store it in the humus in the soil. That's simply changing the way we farm. As you get more humus in the soil, you get healthier soil, healthier food, healthier people. So if we want financial health in New Zealand, and if we want physical health in New Zealand, we actually need to support our farmers. We need to invest in the things that will help them achieve better results. And we need to stop the over-regulation of the industry that is making it too hard for them to farm. Rules like the wealth tax that is being proposed. That wealth tax will drive farmers off the farm because you may have an asset worth a lot of money, but you're not actually getting a massive turnover off it. For instance, if you've got a $10 million farm, that tax will be $100,000 per annum. You will not have the turnover for it. You can't afford it. You're driven off the land. And the trouble is, once we lose farming off the land, it's not just the farmers. It's the shearers, it's the milkers, it's the fencers, it's the guys doing irrigation, and then it's the towns that support them, the mechanics and the shops, etc. That means the schools close down, they lose the hospitals, the doctor services, those whole communities shut down in New Zealand. So farming is more than just a direct income from the sale of produce. Farming is a lifestyle. It is actually part of who we are as New Zealanders, and we grow the best food in the world. You know, New Zealand farmers produce enough food for 40 million people worldwide. And people need food, it's an essential service. So as a party we're saying stop banging the farmers, stop knocking them on the head, actually start encouraging them and supporting them because we need them for our recovery. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leighton. Our second speaker on this topic is going to be Geoff Simmons. Give him a warm welcome, folks.
Kia ora koutou. Hey, well, there's a lot that I agree with on Leighton on that particular topic, and there's a few areas that I disagree with as well, which is important because we're supposed to be debating here. So first off, I really want to acknowledge the areas of agreement. 100% agree that we should not be using pine trees as an offset for fossil fuel emissions. In fact, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, the government's chief advisor, on environmental issues said this very same thing. We shouldn't be using pine trees to offset our fossil fuel emissions. That's because pine trees are short-lived, and as we've seen in Nelson last summer, they can quite easily go up in smoke. So we should be using forestry to offset our agricultural emissions. So I think if perfectly prepared to agree with Leighton that we shouldn't be using pine trees to offset our fossil fuel emissions, but they are still an important way of transitioning land use to being sustainable overall. So pine trees will have their place within that, as will native trees, and we need to be encouraging, another area I agree with Leighton on, we need to encourage farmers to be planting native trees on their riverbanks and on their erosion-prone land, actually rewarding them for that. Because our current emissions trading scheme doesn't do that. It doesn't reward farmers for planting on places like riverbanks. It also doesn't reward farmers for safeguarding existing areas of native bush. That's why you see a lot of very raggedy looking native bush around the country, because farmers have no incentive to look after it. And that is an important store of carbon and an important place for our native species to hang out in. Important for our biodiversity. So, totally agree that we should support farmers. The one big area, however, where there are huge issues in New Zealand is on water quality. So, firstly, to acknowledge that water quality is mainly a problem in our cities. Our cities have the worst streams in our entire country, the most polluted streams. However, that's only 1% of our waterways. Our farmland, our pasture land, makes up roughly 40% of our waterways, and that's the second most polluted area that we've got. Now, I agree with Leighton that we don't want to burden farmers with lots of regulation telling them how to do it. But what Top's saying is, let's give farmers the ability to work together in their catchments to work out how to solve the problem. And then if they can't get their act together, then we talk about regulation. So it's having that, you want that thread of regulation hanging over their head, but ideally farmers can come together in their communities and work out how to solve the problem without us having to tell them how to farm.
Thank you, Geoff. And to round us off, let's have Amanda Vickers from Social Critic. Give her a warm welcome.
Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Amanda Vickers from Social Critic, and the other two candidates have raised some very good points, some of which we agree with. Basically, one of Social Critic's tenets and principles is that we are not going to compromise our ecology or our environment or our waterways or our health just for profit. And we think at the moment that farming has become really over-intensified, and we are seeing all sorts of ecological problems like topsoils becoming eroded and a huge reliance on superphosphate and nitrates having to go on the land, and the land has become really leaky, and as we all know, our rivers are at tipping point because the nitrates going into the rivers. There's only so much we can do to expect farmers to mitigate this themselves, because a lot of them are really up to their eyeballs in debt. And if we want a farming system that is regenerative and healthy for our ecosystems, our animals and our people and our topsoil, which is where everything comes from, we simply have to give them more support than that. Now, one of Social Credit's main principles is obviously monetary reform, and that is how we're going to help these farmers transform their farms to regenerative farming systems and support them. So right now, the private commercial banks create more and more and more New Zealand dollars that goes into the economy every year. Most people don't know this. We're not having that. That function is going to be returned to the country's own bank, the Reserve Bank, where it should be. And therefore we're going to be able to use that same amount of money for social purposes, for the environment and for the economy. And that includes helping our farmers transform their farms to regenerative farming systems. There's a lot of things involved in that, and I'm not an expert on it, but I do know that's the future, and some farms are already doing this with great success, but they need more support. So we would provide farm advisors, but we'd also reintroduce the Rural Bank, which will be funded by the Reserve Bank. And for the farmers who want to change their farm to a regenerative farming system, we'll get interest-free loans to help with those costs, plus potentially some of their debt written off if they can manage to meet specific goals, because that is going to benefit their farm, but all the way down the river with the water quality, the health of their animals, the health of the people. And that's my phone ringing, I'm really sorry. And so that is the social credit solution to farming future in New Zealand. And I've got 5 seconds left. I just want to say we also oppose carbon credits.
Thank you so much, Amanda. So, for all you folks watching at home, I would love for you to be giving us some questions as well. If you comment on the streams on YouTube and Facebook, we'll read those comments and we'll be able to ask the candidates these questions later. But before we get to that, we've got some more questions selected by the candidates themselves. And question number 2 is Geoff's question. Geoff would like the candidates to speak on. Oh, got the wrong thing here. Bringing down the cost of housing and rent. So all candidates 3 minutes on this, starting with Geoff Simmons.
Kia ora. So, in my view, housing is the biggest issue that we face in New Zealand right now. It's the biggest social issue. It's the leading driver of poverty, because it's the reason why the rich are getting richer, because asset prices are increasing, and it's the reason that the poor are getting poorer, because the cost of rent is rising. Certainly for the last 25 years, housing has been the leading driver of child poverty, and that in turn leads to all sorts of terrible social outcomes in terms of poor education and health outcomes, teen suicide rates, high prison rates, all come back to that issue of child poverty. So what really, housing is also the leading economic issue we face, because we are putting so much of our money into housing, we don't have enough money to invest in businesses that actually create exports and jobs. So on one hand, housing is unaffordable because the prices are so high, but it's also unaffordable because our incomes as a country are so low. And part of the reason for that is because we stick all of our money into housing. So, 2 sides to the housing issue in terms of how to fix it, the demand side and the supply side. Firstly, the demand side, we have some of the highest taxes on other forms of investment in the Western world, so that's businesses, KiwiSaver bank deposits. We have some of the lowest taxes on property in the Western world, and that difference is what drives people to invest in property over everything. You may be wanting to expand your business, employ more people. Why bother taking on more people when it's much easier to avoid the health and safety issues, avoid the employment costs, just buy a rental property? Much easier way to make money. Also, of course, over the past decade, immigration has been a major driver of that demand side issue, pushing up the price, the cost of housing. But on the other side, supply is an issue as well. And this is where we have seen, again, for the last 30 years, a very restrictive supply system. And the major driver around that is our Resource Management Act. It's pushed people into sprawling. So we need to encourage cities to grow, to build up around our public and active transport networks. And thankfully the government is starting to talk about that sort of thing, but the major thing that they aren't talking about is the infrastructure that is needed for our cities to grow up. We need water infrastructure, we need public transport infrastructure. Local authorities have 40% of the infrastructure in this country and only 7% of the revenue to deal with it. So we need a massive investment from government to re-engineer our cities so that everyone can live close to where they work and play. Kia ora.
Thank you, Geoff. And next up, Amanda.
I have a timer. Ladies and gentlemen, Social Credit's housing policy ensures that anyone in New Zealand who doesn't have their own home to own will be able to have one. So what's going to enable that is we are going to use some reserve bank money that is exactly the same amount of money that the private banks create now, but now we will have the Reserve Bank issuing that instead, and that is going to be, some of that is going to be used towards buying or building suitable housing. So that's not what the private developers are building at the moment, which is, you know, upper quartile, high-priced housing that lower-wage people just cannot afford. It's going to be the houses that we've got a huge deficit of at the moment, which is lower quartile houses, but they're going to be practical, functional, but they will be smaller and they will be cheaper. And then what we're going to do is we're going to provide loans for these people. So what it's going to be is very low interest, but it's also going to be, repayment's going to be based on the term of the loan rather than having to pay it off over, you know, 10 or 15 or 20 years. Because these people are on lower incomes, so the term's going to have to be much bigger, but they will still own their own home, they will still have that security of tenure, they will still feel like they have a place to call their own. And so that's really important. And the repayments are going to be set at 25% of the adequate living income, which is a different policy of social credits. So that is going to take a lot of pressure off the housing market in terms of the prices of housing. We're also going to continue with state-owned housing stock for those who want to continue renting. And Geoff raised a really good point. It's not just about fulfilling the supply, it's the demand as well. And so in terms of immigration, it's come down somewhat from 70,000 to 55,000. We're going to reduce it from about 25,000 is what we think we can get immigration down to, just to ease that demand as well. So what that will do is reduce the pressure on rents, because there'll be more housing as well. Yep. And so this sort of thing has been done before in the 1930s. The first Labour government built 30,000 state houses with Reserve Bank money. We came out of the Depression well in terms of OECD standards. It provided employment, it provided warm houses, and we didn't have an inflationary crisis. So it has been done before, and it has been done in New Zealand, and we need to do it again. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Amanda. And
Perfect timing there. Leighton, lucky last on the question of housing.
fantastic, thank you very much. Firstly, I'd like to agree with Geoff on the fact that providing people with houses does help them out of poverty, because houses give you security and also better for your health. I would like to say that I think one of the pressures on housing is actually relationship and family breakdown, because when a family breaks down, you now need two houses to house that family. And so that is actually a causation. It's a causation in crime as well. Virtually every person incarcerated in New Zealand has come from a broken family. And so actually addressing relationships is important for our housing. The other part of our housing, I agree, is immigration. And we've been saying it for 4 years. If we reduce immigration to net zero until our housing stock is caught up, is the best thing we can do for the poor people in New Zealand. Why? Because at the moment, if you're an immigrant and you come to New Zealand, you have enough money to secure a house. If there's a limited supply, it's the people at the bottom end of the market that drop off, and they're the ones that miss out on a house. So net zero immigration until we have our housing stock up is important. So how do we make it more affordable? New Zealand prices of housing is really expensive. We pay a lot more than our Australian neighbours, and part of that is because it's restricted supply. So if you want to bring a new product into New Zealand, you actually have to get it either code marked or brands appraised. That's about a $50,000 or $60,000 process, along with taking about 6 months. The trouble is, we're such a small market that it's uneconomic for you to invest that much to bring a new product in, and so therefore people don't. So we're restricted to the supply we have. I'll give you an example. Glass we have in New Zealand selling about $80 a square metre. It's actually purchased at $4 a square metre. And that's the difference. I can buy a tilt and turn double glazed low E window off the shelf in Germany for $50. Here in New Zealand it costs $800. So that the cost of actual materials is too high in New Zealand compared to what the people pay overseas. And the other thing is land. I mean, New Zealand's got the most usable land per head of population of any country. Australia's got more land, but most of it's desert, so who wants to live there? But New Zealand has the most usable land, so we shouldn't be paying so much. But one of the reasons, and I'll agree with Geoff again, it's funding. Our councils get such a small amount of funding to develop all that infrastructure, and we need to reallocate funds to allow local regional councils to have more money to invest in infrastructure so that our housing prices can come down. And the other part of our housing prices is the fact that we do everything bespoke. So every house is built as a one-off in some degrees, and that is also expensive. So people have floated the idea of doing prefabricated houses. A prefabricated house and a house built on site uses exactly the same amount of materials. Okay? So the only way that prefab can drive the houses down is if you have security of demand. So that's demand continuing year after year, so you can invest in the infrastructure for a prefab. And we don't have that in New Zealand. So that has to change if we're going to drive those construction prices down. What we can do, and I'd encourage you to look at, there's a guy called Tiny who lives in Rotorua. He's New Zealand's most effective houser of the homeless, and one key way is actually mixed ownership, where the government owns part of it, and the family owns part, and they gradually buy the government out. Because I agree, getting people in houses has got to be a priority for New Zealand. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you once again to all of our candidates. We have got one more question that's been proposed by the candidates themselves, which they'll speak on. And after that, we're going to get to your questions, you lovely people here in the audience, and you lovely people over there. There we go, on the internet. So, final question. Discuss the statement that the government should access the additional funding it needs directly from the Reserve Bank. Amanda.
Thank you.
Thanks. This is one of our key ideas of social credit, because we don't believe we should be using private commercial banks to access our needed money, and I'm going to explain why. Because New Zealand has our own bank, so if we need more money, which we do at the moment for the COVID crisis, we really should have a government that is going to try and fund that in the most financially sensible way, in the way that would benefit all New Zealanders, that would certainly not cause them to spend extra money that's not necessary in the way of terms or in the way of interest rates. But our government is not having any of that. Our government is not using our country's own bank, which is the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. They would prefer to use private commercial banks and pay them interest, and that is costing you all and your children and your grandchildren $5 billion every single year that's coming out, of your tax, but ultimately is coming out of the productive economy where it's needed, especially when we're in a recession in times like this. So it has to be drawn out of the productive economy to pay to those private banks that are overseas owned, so that then that profit is shipped off overseas. Now, how is that in your best interests? I mean, we're all up here talking about the problems we need to overcome. We need more regenerative farming. We've got a housing crisis. We've got an inequality and a poverty crisis. We've got underfunded DHBs. I mean, the list goes on. Why are we spending $5 billion to give it to private banks? Now, if you asked Grant Robertson, what he would say is, we want to charge Kiwis that money because we don't want to blur financial, fiscal and monetary boundaries. I mean, all sorts of lovely word mincing, but what it really means is it's costing you money. He also talks about, maintaining the independence of the Reserve Bank. Look, there's ways around these problems if you start to think outside the box. We can run the Reserve Bank in an independent manner. It's just Grant Robertson chooses not to. Now, I don't know why that is. Maybe he wants to placate the bankers, or whatever the reason is. We need to do what we did in the 1930s and use the country's own bank. It worked then, and it can work now. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Amanda. Next, I believe, is Leighton. Do I have that right? No, it's Geoff.
Is that? Very good.
Yes, Geoff.
So, monetary policy is an incredibly complicated topic. I'm not sure we can cover it off in 3 minutes. But there is some validity to the issues that Amanda is raising. We do have at the moment a situation where the Reserve Bank is offering to create something like $100 billion and use that money to purchase debt off the purchase crown debt off the banks. Now, the only people who win out of this situation are the banks, because the banks have already bought this debt off the Reserve Bank and are obviously charging a markup when they sell it on to the Reserve Bank. So there is no reason why the Reserve Bank needs to purchase that debt off the banks. They could just purchase it straight off the government and erase that debt permanently. They could. Of course, you know, the concern with that sort of approach to monetary policy is often that it will cause inflation, but in the situation we're in right now, the chances of inflation are pretty minimal. However, there's a much bigger political issue here. The question is, if you're going to write someone a $100 billion blank cheque, do you want to hand it to Winston Peters? Which, sadly, is the situation we're in as a country. The reason why having some sort of, fiscal restraint on our government is because our politicians don't necessarily spend money where it is best spent. So the question longer term is, if we are going to change our monetary policy model so that the government can create money, how do we then ensure that our government puts that money into the place where they get the best return on investment, rather than just blowing it all, building a port in Northland to try and buy an election, which is the sad situation that we're facing at the moment. Billions of dollars are being chucked around in order to buy votes by various politicians. So what we're proposing at the moment in terms of our current situation is, we don't trust the politicians with that particular money, but if the Reserve Bank is going to create money, let's give it to the people. Quantitative easing for the people.
Yeah.
So how that would work is basically the Reserve Bank could create that money, hand it to people in the form of a UBI, regular payments for a limited time while we're in this COVID situation, while we're in this difficult economic times. And for those people that have debt, that money could be used to write off that debt, because, as Amanda points out, that's currently how money is currently created by our banking system. So largely it could prove neutral from a monetary policy perspective. Anyway, there you go.
Thank you, Geoff. And finally, Leighton, your opinion on Reserve Bank's monetary policy.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'll have to agree with Geoff on some of this. The problem we've got is, do we want to allow the government to have more money to spend? And I believe, when a government spends $572,000 on a slide, or $16 million just on advice from COVID, they are not good stewards of our money, because they're not spending their own money, they're spending ours, and that is the real issue. I like what Geoff said about the universal basic income being for a short period, because my problem is, once you just give people money, you actually reduce their desire to actually achieve. And we've seen that after so much time, where people are off work for more than, I think it's 15 weeks, there's only a 30% chance of them going back into full-time employment, because they've lost the desire. And we actually have to keep people working. We've got to make sure our money is a hand up, not a hand out, and we've got to incentivise people to be creative. So what we need to do as a nation is we need to provide the opportunity for people to realise their dreams. Most of you people here would have had a cunning plan at some stage, some good idea, something you'd like to invent or start or change or do. And we need to incentivise that and encourage that, because that gives you a goal, that gives you a motivation, that gives you a driver to do. At the same time, we need to say to the government, you actually need to be fiscally responsible with the money we give you, which they are not. And so part of, we believe, of that is actually having a system where we, the people, can control the government between elections, which we cannot do at the moment. At the moment, the government, once they're voted in for the next 3 years, can do exactly what they want, and we have got no say in it. That needs to change. So we as a party are saying bring in binding citizens-initiated referenda to allow the people of New Zealand to actually have some say on what the government is doing. And there must be boundaries on them. We're also saying shrink the size of government. The problem with a bigger government is a bigger government makes more rules for the productive sector to meet, and that slows down the productive sector, which means we get less income in. When we get less income in, there's less for all of us to share, and that is the problem we see right now. A bigger government is more wasteful, and it drains our finances and makes us poorer. And the other thing we need to do financially is actually the government needs to be sourcing its resources from New Zealand wherever possible. Classic example, we've got a contract for about $2 billion for trains and carriages at the moment. They can be built in New Zealand. They should be built in New Zealand because that money then goes round and round in New Zealand instead of offshore. So when we go and source things offshore, that money disappears from circulation in New Zealand. We don't get it spent at our local shops, we don't get tax off it, it is a negative. In regards to the actual banking system, the problem is, why has the government sold out to these big banks and actually allowed them to take control of our money? It hasn't worked, it hasn't been beneficial, and those big banks now are creating $1 billion in profit out of us each per annum. That is not sustainable for us in this environment, so I would agree we need to empower the Reserve Bank more. Thank you.
All right, well, that's all we have for tonight for the politicians controlling the debate. Now it's your turn to control the debate. So I'm going to start it off with a question which has come from somewhere on the internet, and then I'll go to one from the room. So cook up all your questions now. This one is for each of the parties. You have 1 minute to answer. The question is, can you give me one bottom line policy that you would not give up in coalition agreements with either Labour or National, whoever it is? And the order, let's go back to our original order, so starting with Leighton.
Like all the minor parties, we're all hoping to get 51%, so we don't have to have any bottom lines, we can do whatever we like. At this stage, it's slightly unlikely to happen, so what we're saying is binding citizens-initiated referenda gives voice back to the people. Because we believe for a healthy democracy, we need to have control over the government. We employ them to represent us. At the moment, no government has ever honoured a citizens-initiated referenda, even when it's had 90% support. To me, that's a total disregard for democracy. It's a poke in the eye to the voters. So we believe binding citizens-initiated referenda gives us the voters' power over the government, and that would be our bottom line. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Thank you. One bottom line policy.
Yeah, I mean, for me, every time house prices rise from here, it's a social and economic disaster. It makes poverty worse, it sucks money out of our economy, and it's, increasing, generally speaking, it's increasing our international debt and making our economy more precarious to risk. So my bottom line would be, whatever you're going to do as a government, it has to be holding the cost of housing and rent stable at the very least. Because like I said, every time house prices rise, it's a social and economic disaster. So that might be a mixture of planning reforms, tax reforms, immigration reforms, all those sorts of things that can help hold the price of housing stable. Thanks.
Look, our definite basic underlying policy is actually the one I've just spoken about, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to take the opportunity to speak about it again, because that is our one underlying bottom line, that the Reserve Bank will fund the government for the money it needs instead of private banks. That is just the most important thing we can do to save Kiwis $5 billion every single year. And so, we don't have we're not saying we would or wouldn't go into coalition with either National or Labour. It would be basically who will allow us to actually use our country's own bank, because that is the bottom line, common sense, biggest thing out of all the policies we can do, because we can achieve so much more if we can not have the debt and also pay no interest. It could be done on a perpetual zero coupon bond. It could be done with, is my minute up? There's lots of ways to do it. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Amanda. All right, audience, live audience, it's your time. I have one rule for my question, which is that it has to be short enough that I can remember it and say it back to the people on the internet. Right. Yes, in the front.
Everyone's had very strong domestic policies, but that is not the only relevant area of politics. So my question to everyone is regarding foreign policy. If you have a role in government, how will you use your influence on New Zealand's foreign policy? The areas I'm particularly interested in are our role in the Pacific and containing China. Thank you.
All right, so for the folks, the internet can hear the question, I'm being told. Is that true, internet? All right, well, if you didn't hear it's about foreign policy, they've got 1 minute to answer. Yeah, Amanda, why not? We'll go reverse order.
So we have an armed neutrality policy. We are not interested in having set allies and set non-allies. We don't think that is the way to operate. We do believe in being armed and being able to defend ourselves, but totally sort of like the Switzerland in terms of being able to, just an armed neutrality there. And what was the other branch of that? Sorry.
The Pacific and China.
Yeah, with the RIMPAC, that's not something that we feel like that's just playing war games to show our dominance, and it's not what we don't endorse that at all. And also we have a lot of different policies that will get rid of China's influence on New Zealand as well, especially economically, especially buying us up. But I think that's my minute up. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so massive question, foreign policy. What I'd say firstly on the Pacific region, are definitely our cousins, and that's really important to maintain that relationship and to maintain the leadership that we show in that area. I think the approach of giving primacy to that in our aid policy, and also in terms of our refugee policy, I think going forward, as climate change worsens, we are going to have to start talking about how we help our Pacific cousins with that. And I think there's room for a Pacific refugee visa there. In terms of containing China, we definitely need to, I agree with Amanda, we need to maintain our independence. There will be a continued spat between the US and China, and we should be trying to stay out of that. And diversifying our economy and our exports is the best way that we can do that.
Yeah, in regards to foreign policy in China, I totally agree. We must diversify our trade. At the moment, we're benefiting from about $5 billion with our trade with China, but we're actually exporting essentials. So we're exporting food, we're exporting water, we're exporting basic raw materials, and we're importing luxury items or non-necessities as our imports. And unfortunately, that doesn't actually help us as a nation. So we do need to diversify trade. We need to trade more with Canada, with Britain, obviously with Brexit, but also with developing countries like India and Pakistan, because there's such massive populations and we produce food. It is a great idea for us to be able to hit the elite over there with our high quality food, and that's one way we can actually disempower China. You notice that India and China are now against each other. China's joined the Americans and the Australians in the South China Seas. That is a big thing. We cannot get involved in it because we've got two small frigates and each one has got one pop gun. It's not wise for us to go there. But as far as defence goes, we need to be targeting what can we do as a nation for defence, what would actually really work. Whether it's very small, fast patrol boats or possibly diesel submarines.
Thank you, Leighton. Interesting answer. All right, I'm going to take one more question from the room. Do we have a question? Yes?
In the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests in the US, what role does your party see for police?
All right, Internet, did you hear that question? I don't know why I'm asking you. I can't see you when I'm standing up here. All right, we have a question about the Black Lives Matter movement and how that relates to New Zealand. Policing. How that relates to New Zealand policing. All right, Leighton, let's start with you.
I fully support peaceful protest, but what we've seen with the Black Lives Matter movement is not peaceful protest, it's been destructive. And what really concerns me is this young lady in Australia who was arrested for putting out a post on Facebook encouraging people for a peaceful protest about the lockdown in Australia. She was arrested in her home and handcuffed in front of her family for putting a post out about a peaceful protest, and yet the Black Lives Matter movement have destroyed property and have destroyed statues and pulled them down, and nothing happens. I think there's a disparity there. We need the same rules for everyone. The police must treat everyone with equally and with the same respect, and I don't think this is happening at the moment. Peaceful protest is fine, but you should have no right to destroy other people's property or destroy history because of your personal beliefs. That doesn't work. Democracy is about debate. There's a great Māori proverb that goes, the food of leaders is to talk, is to talk, is to talk. Debate and discussion in democracy is imperative, but violent protest doesn't have a place in civil society.
So, if I'm to interpret the question, does New Zealand policing have a problem with racism? I don't. I'm choosing to interpret the question in that way anyway. I mean, I think there is pretty good evidence that as a society and that we have problems with unconscious bias in many areas of our society, and policing is one of them. That Māori are more likely to be stopped and searched, they're more likely to be convicted for the same crime, they're more likely to be sentenced more harshly for the same crime. I mean, thankfully, I don't think we have quite the same problem with police shootings as they do in the United States. But I think still that unconscious bias is permeating through our society, and there is a need for training our police force to try to lessen that.
Thank you, Geoff.
So I don't think we've got an absolute specific policy on this, but however, the first role of police is to protect and serve and be there for the people, and once police start, as Leighton said, arresting people for putting up a post on Facebook about speaking out about something in their society they don't like, I mean, Australia's really close to home. That's quite scary stuff. So, I mean, I've been watching everything really closely going, whoa, I think that's completely wrong. And so one of the things for me when you watch all these violent Black Lives Matter protests is, why is it happening? And I think, as far as I'm concerned, inequality causes all sorts of separations in society. It causes distrust, it causes people to feel disconnected, but also it causes the cohesion within society to break down, and I think that contributes to any sort of racism that we're seeing. And I think that if we can focus on inequality, the actual problem would actually start to resolve things.
Thank you, candidates. I have some questions now which are coming from the internet, and I've got one directed at each of the parties. I will start with social credit. A writer from the internet would like to know, what will be the effect on New Zealand dollars exchange rate if the Reserve Bank is to print money?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. It is tied into inflation, but the exchange rate would become something that is part of the mandate of the Reserve Bank, and the Reserve Bank would become an independent office of Parliament with set criteria, and it wouldn't just be to regulate the exchange rate. Changing any system can be a little bit disruptive, but long term we're going to have less poverty, less inequality, and a thriving, real and productive economy. And long term, these foreign traders and investors and all the trade that goes in and out of New Zealand is going to actually see the system is stable and it can work much better than the system now. And what's more, New Zealand's a thriving place with a thriving economy. So there might be a little bit of a bump there. Reserve Bank will be in charge of the looking at the economic indicators to make all the changes necessary independently of the government. Thanks.
Thank you, Amanda. The next question is for Top. The other candidates have mentioned regenerative farming when they were talking in the farming question. Where does Top stand on regenerative farming?
Yeah, great question. So it's first worth acknowledging that most of our farmers already do about 80% of the practices of regenerative farming. So they're already doing a pretty good job in that respect. There is more that can be done, and I think one of the key things that needs to happen, which I think Leighton mentioned, is that we need to pull back on the intensity of farming. And actually we can do this in a way that doesn't reduce farming profit, but actually reduces the environmental impact hugely without impacting on farms' bottom lines. Throughout most of the country, that's really going to solve most of our environmental issues. In terms of strict regenerative farming, we just need to test each of the principles and see what works in different parts of the country. But I think compared to overseas, New Zealand's already doing a lot of it already.
Thank you, Geoff. And finally for Leighton, our questioner on the internet would like to know, who does Aotearoa belong to?
Great question. I believe it belongs to all New Zealand citizens. People ask me where I was born. I was born in New Zealand. I come from New Zealand. I don't come from anywhere else. I don't identify with anywhere else. I just identify with New Zealand. I was born in Lower Hutt, went to Masterton, started schooling in Vickers, did most of my primary schooling in Rotorua, did my secondary schooling in Auckland, started work up the far north, started my building and did my apprenticeship in Auckland, got married in Auckland, and I now live in Canterbury. So New Zealand is my home. And I believe anyone that's a New Zealand citizen that calls New Zealand a home, it belongs to all of us. And we're all responsible for it. We're the ones that have to have guardianship over it, and we need to do it together in discussion. Because it's not about one group surpassing another group, it's about us working together as people in this nation to protect it. I firmly believe New Zealand is about the best nation in the world to live. I want it to remain that way for my children and my grandchildren, and for that reason I believe we need to treat people with equality and respect. Thank you.
Thank you, Leighton. All right, I'm ready for some questions from the room. I saw your hand go up real fast.
For all candidates, particularly Leighton, do you acknowledge the wrongs and the Treaty of Waitangi since 1840 and how they are to be righted, how the wrongs can be made right?
Absolutely.
Okay, we'll start with Leighton then.
All candidates, particularly Leighton.
Yep. We agree the Treaty of Waitangi is a really important document for New Zealand because it was the first time that any occupying nation had formed a treaty that actually allowed both groups of them to actually have equal rights within that nation. It gave equal property rights, it ended slavery. You know, slavery ended in Britain in 1830 and we signed the treaty in 1840, which meant all the slaves that were in New Zealand at the time were released in the signing of the treaty. That's a massive bonus. And the treaty is actually saying everyone has equal rights in New Zealand and we need to look together to work forward. So there's two parts. One is the land thing, and what happened with the land is the Europeans were incredibly dishonest and cheated Māori out of a whole lot of land. They cheated them, they stole off them, they put laws that they couldn't keep, dog taxes on them, they cheated them unjustly. That's a justice issue and that must be dealt with in the justice portfolio. So that's where the treaty settlements came. And there was a great quote that was done in the 1940 by, I can't quite remember the guy's name, I apologise, but he was saying we must settle all the claims quickly because once we settle a claim we can look forward instead of looking backward. And I think that's really important for us as a nation, moving forward together.
Yeah, look, we totally support the Treaty of Waitangi, obviously. There's a lot of issues going on and they are reflected in our legal system, and a lot of the injustices that happened can be said to be entirely legal within the legal framework, but that doesn't make them moral. And this is where the Treaty of the Waitangi Tribunal is trying to iron these things out. My personal view is I fully support the moral stance, because just because something's legal doesn't make it moral, and so that's where I would like to see things go forward. But as a party, totally respect the Treaty of Waitangi. Thanks.
Top wants to honour the treaty in terms of putting it into making it part of our written constitution. What I'd like to say about the past treaty claims is a couple of things. Firstly, there's discrepancies between the English and Māori version of the treaty, which are pretty enormous. And secondly, the Māori have settled on treaty claims to the value of between 1 and 2 cents in the dollar on the value of those total treaty claims. So those two major issues have led to this idea of there being, a recognition that we can never really honour the treaty as it was strictly written, and instead we have to honour treaty principles, which are about, working together in partnership to look after each other and find a way forward, particularly over our natural resources. So I don't think it's something that can ever be resolved.
But your time is up. And I'd like one more question from the audience, and I promised I'd get to you.
Okay. Joel Keith, where does your party stand on should firearms be registered to firearms licence holders the same way as cars and motor vehicles are registered to driver's licence holders?
All right, so I don't know if you were audible to the internet. Yeah, okay. So this question was, where is your stance on whether firearms should be registered into a national database?
To firearm licence holders?
Firearms licence holders.
The same way that cars and motor vehicles are registered to
The same way that cars and motor vehicles are licensed to car licence owners. We'll start with Geoff.
Oh, me? So I have to say that this is something that we don't have a policy on. So TOP is an evidence-based party, so we do research before we come to any particular position on things. So I would say if this was something that we were dealing with in Parliament, we'd have to look at the research and look at what's done overseas to see what works. What I would say, just off the top of my head, is that we have licensing for cars and for motorbikes, but we don't have licensing for cycles or skateboards, those sorts of things. So I think there is a response that would be needed that's graduated to the harm that something can cause. And that, as a general principle, I think that applies to firearms as well. I'm not sure where the line would go, but I know that I used to have a slug gun as a kid, and that can do some damage, but probably not as much damage as we'd worry about warranting a license to be attached to. So I think there has to be some sort of system that recognises harm and has regulations according to that.
So I'm the same as Geoff. We don't actually, as far as I'm aware, have a policy on this, so therefore you get my opinion. And I do believe that firearms should be registered to the people, not the individual firearms. I actually have a firearms licence. We had a lifestyle block and my husband was going for the licence, and I wasn't having him have a licence if I didn't have one, so I had to go and get one. Then we found out we don't need one for an air rifle, so there we go. But it's a Class A licence, so it's always been very useful to pull out, and people are always quite amazed when I have a firearms licence. But I went through the process of getting one, and I was really impressed with the teaching and with the person who was taking us through the process. He was methodical, he checked that we understood the important things, and we were reference checked. I actually felt really confident that the people that were getting these licences were fit for them. and he raved about the system actually, how in this country we license the people, not the firearms, and how he thought it was working really well, and I agree. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, the reality of licensing or registering firearms hasn't worked. It didn't work before and it's not working overseas. Our system we had works really, really well, where we have to be people of good character to get a firearms licence. You know, we all think of this one instance where the Christchurch coward came in from Australia, he wasn't vetted properly, he didn't go through the proper process, he got a firearm and he killed a whole lot of people. That just does not happen in New Zealand often. It's this one guy that did not go through the approved process. Most or virtually every single firearm owner in New Zealand has been vetted as a person of good character, and therefore they're able to own a firearm. The firearms registration, the firearms system that was brought in last year is a failed system. Cost us hundreds of millions of dollars, tens of thousands of police hours, and did not take the firearms off the gangs and did not pick up the illegal firearms. So registering them will not work because you're only dealing with law-abiding citizens, not the criminals. That's why that system is never going to work and be an absolute failure.
Moving along. I'm going to move on to one about tactics, which has come from the internet. The question, and I'll ask this to all three parties, is which, if any, electorates is your party targeting in this election? Leighton, why don't we start with you?
We started off targeting one electorate with our deputy leader, which is Takanini, with Elliot Icklade, and he's doing an amazing job there. He's getting out, he's meeting people, it's very personable. But in reality, we've got some awesome candidates. We've got candidates in just about every electorate throughout New Zealand, and they're standing up and doing a massive job there. So across New Zealand, I'd say there's 6 electorates where we've got people that are full-time, at least right now, putting everything they can into winning those electorates. We've probably got at least 20 people that are putting everything they possibly can in along with their full-time work to win that electorate. So we're targeting a whole lot. Our main focus has been on Takanini with Elliot. He's been full-time on it, and he would make a great asset in Parliament. He speaks what he believes, he's got a lot of personal experience, and we would love to see him there.
So we have, TOP have been public that we're putting quite a lot behind our candidate in Ohariu, Jessica Hammond, who came third in 2017 and is an excellent candidate. It's a very close electorate up against Labour and National, and we're really trying to educate people that voting for Labour and National in pretty much any electorate is a completely wasted vote, because generally speaking those people are going to get in regardless. So absolutely Ohariu is our focus, and Jessica is an experienced public servant who would be incredible in Parliament. We also have Ben Peters and Dunedin, who, by virtue of the fact that both of the Labour and National candidates in that area, Michael Woodhouse and David, Clark, yes, David Clark. See, I can't even remember his name. Have both disgraced themselves through this term, so we're giving him a push too.
So all our candidates in social credit are asking for 2 ticks for the candidate and the party vote. We are putting a lot of emphasis on Chris Leach and Paul Ray, who's been dedicated to that region for many electoral cycles and has done a lot for the region, and I think he would be an absolutely fantastic MP representing their electorate. Thanks.
Alright, one more from the internet, and this also goes to all three parties. This questioner asks, why are there 200,000 unoccupied homes?
There's a massive amount of unoccupied homes in New Zealand for a few reasons. One is the Tenancy Act. The Tenancy Act gives more rights to the renters than the landlord. And if you've saved up and scrimped and saved for a property, do you really want to give ownership of it virtually to someone else where they have more control over it? But the reality is there's so many homes in New Zealand that are empty because people have bought them as investments. And a lot of those are international people. So if we're going to deal with that, we just need to look at, should people that are not New Zealand citizens or residents be able to buy residential property in New Zealand? If they are, should we have a stamp duty on it? So if you're a New Zealand resident or citizen, you pay no stamp duty on your first or second house. After that, you might pay 7% on your third. After that, 15% on any subsequent. But if you're not a New Zealand citizen or a New Zealand resident, you pay 15% straight out the bat on any residential property. On top of that, we'd say if you're not a New Zealand resident or citizen, you shouldn't be allowed to own any commercial property. That includes farms. Because we have a limited amount of land, we don't really want it going into foreign ownership. So why do we have empty houses? People making a lot of money, we've made it very attractive for them. People can't buy land in their own country, and so they're buying it here.
So Leighton is absolutely right. Our house prices are going up so fast that they're seen as an amazing investment for many asset owners, and it's continuing now. And until we can show that house prices are going to steady or just go up at the price of inflation, it's likely to continue. So we talked about all the mechanisms before where that can be stopped, but I just want to point out that, as Geoff said, this $100 billion that the Reserve Bank's creating at the moment to buy back government bonds, so it's putting all this liquidity into these asset owners, and they're looking for something to do with it. And the Reserve Bank's already shown a lot of this is going into, they're just buying up houses because it's seen as a really good investment. So at the moment, it's pumping up asset prices in all sorts of assets, but especially in housing, and that's exactly what happens when this kind of faulty system is implemented.
I do have to disagree with Leighton here. New Zealand has some of the weakest tenancy laws in the Western world. The government have tightened them up just recently, but there's still a long way from the likes of what you'll see in Europe, where tenants have the right to call a house a home. And I do think one of the really big issues in New Zealand is that people make more money out of their homes' capital gain than they do from actually renting them out. We need to kill house price growth so that people have an incentive to actually rent out their homes, and also to build on empty land, because it's just another form of land banking, right? And a big part of that is taxing property the same as we tax other assets. So TOP doesn't want to increase the amount of tax, but we do want to tax property the same as other assets, use that to reduce the tax on other investments, so that if you've got money to invest, you're just as well off putting it into a business as to a property.
All right, we have time for one or two more from the audience. Your hand went up real fast. It's your turn.
What would your party do to further the success of minority groups, specifically the LGBTQ plus community and ethnic?
Okay, what would your party do to further the success of minority groups, including LGBT and ethnic minorities? Can we start with Geoff Simmons?
All right, so minorities in general, the question was LGBT and what else? Ethnic minorities, yeah. So I think the big picture answer to that TOP has is that we are calling for a written constitution to be developed, and that would allow New Zealanders to actually know what their rights were. And unlike the current Bill of Rights Act, that should be enshrined so that it can't be messed with by politicians, passing laws whenever they like. So we want a written constitution that has really clear rights, protects the rights of minorities, including gender and ethnic minorities, and use that to ensure that laws aren't passed which are contrary to those people's particular rights. We'd also like to protect the environment too, but I don't have time to talk about it.
Yeah, once again, I don't think we have anything specifically written about LGBTQ, but in terms of minority groups, we certainly support their equality and their contribution to society, and that goes with every sort of aspect of our policy, including binding citizens-initiated referendum, which makes sure they cannot be written against any minority group, which is a really important aspect of that. But apart from that, we fully support their equality.
See, I don't really like agreeing with Geoff so much, but we support the idea of a written constitution as well that has the Human Rights Act in it as well as the Magna Carta put in it. As regards to ethnic minorities, we're down in Invercargill, and you'd be surprised, but Invercargill has a massive ethnic minority ethnic groups in it, a whole lot of them. And so we got talking to some, and they're saying the issues they faced, and what they said to us is no government has ever spoken to them directly about the issues. So these are people that have become as refugees to New Zealand, they've been put down in Invercargill, they've come from South America, so the whole environment's foreign to them. No one has actually spoken to them about the major issues they face, and some of them are actually not huge issues. 40-year-old guys who can't actually transfer their driver's licence, so now they've got to get a learner's licence and can't take their children to school or drive to work themselves. Little things like that. So one of the biggest things we can do is actually listen to people. And that's what I was saying earlier, wasn't it? You know, the food of leaders is to talk, is to talk, is to talk. And I think it's vitally important we discuss with the people concerned the issues they face.
Okay, we have time for one more question from the audience, right at the back. Hey, can you just repeat the question, because I don't think we got that on
his
the
question is, as a party we're saying we want to support all people, but when he reads through our policies, our community policy, he's challenging us on that. He's challenging us on that in regards to some of the things we say about the treaty regarding Māori seats, and he's also challenging us on that when we talk about the fact that we don't want to over-sexualise the children in schools. His question is, teach people differently in that. I'll answer both. In regards to the Māori seats were set up purposely when Māori had no vote. So Māori were excluded from having any influence in society by the government at the time that made the rules so Māori had no say. So that's why the Māori seats were brought in. Now Māori have great representation in Parliament. So the rule of Commission of Inquiry into our electoral system said do away with the Māori seats but drop the threshold down to 1%. In regards to how we treat people individuals, as an individual you have rights yourself as you're an adult to do things, but we do not believe we should be sexualising children in school. We should leave children to grow and to have their childhood, and when they're adults they can make their decisions, but we should not be teaching them in school there's multiple genders when that's actually not based on science or medicine.
Okay, we have run out of time here, but what I am going to do is give each of the candidates just 1 more minute to sum up why the electorate should vote for you in this upcoming election, and I'd like to start with Amanda.
So we are faced with enormous challenges. Our country was faced with enormous challenges before we had COVID, and all parties except for Social Credit want to address this by either taxing people out of the economy or borrowing more from banks. It's like shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic. It's like trying to find money from somewhere that doesn't exist, that we've got to pay back or that people are losing. When you're in a recession or a depression, we need more money in the economy. Using our own bank makes common sense. And Social Credit is the only party that is actually offering this kind of solution for our economy to go forwards, because it's quite clear that our country hasn't had enough money coming in because of all the social, environmental and economic problems we can see that we've got. We just can't afford to fix everything on the status quo. There's thousands of different problems across every sector. Is my time up? So vote Social Credit in 2020.
Actually, I would just encourage you to vote intelligently this year. Go and look at all the different parties and the policies they've got. There'll be a party that suits you. It may be New Conservative, it may not. But vote intelligently. Too many people are going out and just ticking a colour that their parents always ticked. Don't do that. Actually vote for a party that represents your values. Because when you vote for what represents your values, you're not wasting your vote. You waste your vote when you vote for something that you think may get in when they don't actually represent you. So my big encouragement is don't vote someone out this year. Vote for a party that has the policies, the people and the principles that you agree with. because that's your right as a voter, and that's how democracy works. You know, we don't want absolute freedom, we don't want absolute safety, we need to find the place in the middle, and that comes through discussion and through democracy, and that is why free speech and using your democratic rights is so important, and encourage all your friends to do exactly the same. Thank you for your time tonight.
Yeah, so TOP is all about real change that gives people the opportunity to fulfill their potential, and only you know what your potential is. Only you know only you know yourself and what you're capable of, and we don't think that the government can tell you how to achieve that or what that potential is. So it's all about giving people opportunities to do that. The major focus for us in 2020 is affordable housing and rent, which I've talked about quite a lot, but also a universal basic income, a complete reform of the tax and welfare system to make it modern, simple and fair, to give people a certainty of a certain level of income every week so that they can do the things that they've always wanted to do, start that business, retrain, take that job, and you won't get those nasty welfare clawbacks that trap people in poverty in the current welfare system. But I just want to finish by agreeing with Leighton. Vote for who you want to vote for. It'll never be a wasted vote. Kia ora.
And that's it. That's it for us today. Thank you to all of you who came along and gave us a lovely studio audience, and thank you to all of you who are watching on the internet as well. Can I ask all the candidates to just come back again up in front of the camera, and one more round of applause for these great people who have taken the time out to... So everybody out there as well, remember to vote. This would be all pretty pointless if we got through it and then none of us remembered to vote. It is October the 17th, Saturday is the final day for voting. You may enrol on the day, but please enrol earlier. It'll make it much easier when you actually get into the voting booth. You can also do advance voting this year for, I think, three weeks?
2 weeks.
Yeah.
2 weeks.
2 weeks and 3 days.
October 3rd is the day when you can start doing your advance voting. So get in, make a difference, vote for somebody you believe in this year. Thank you very much.
A big round of applause for Ben.
All right, we're going to be sticking around, so if you have more questions for the candidates, those of you in